I never thought my story would begin with a funeral. The air was heavy with magnolia and unresolved truths the day I returned to Charleston. The sun filtered through the moss-draped oaks like broken promises, warm but untrustworthy. My heels echoed across the marble floors of St. Augustine's Chapel, each step a reminder that I didn't belong here, or so they believed. I was the girl no one talked about, the name never spoken at family dinners, the shadow behind the powerful man everyone revered. And yet I stood there, front row at the memorial for Jonathan Whitmore, the man who had built an empire from nothing and kept me a secret through it all. Charleston's beloved Titan, my father. I wore black, not for grief, but for armor. I wasn't here to mourn. I was here to claim what had always been denied to me. The mourners whispered behind veils and programs, their curious eyes flicking toward me. Who's she? I could almost hear them ask. Some might have guessed. Others would pretend they didn't know. But one thing was certain. None of them were ready for what was coming. The will was to be read that afternoon. I still remember how I used to walk past Whitmore Industries as a child, staring up at the glass facade, wondering why I felt drawn to a place I couldn't name. Now, the truth pulsed beneath my skin, like wildfire. The building had my blood in its walls. Its foundation was laid on more than steel and stone. It was built on silence. On me. You see, for years I believed I was unwanted. A mistake. A shameful secret hidden in the quiet corners of a rich man's life. But what happens when the secret refuses to stay buried? Because he didn't just leave me memories. He left me everything. And with it, a war I didn't ask for. When I was growing up, I didn't carry his last name. I carried my mother's silence. My mom, Eleanor, was a quiet woman. Composed, careful, always folding pain into neat corners of her life like she did with laundry. She never told me the full truth, not until it was too late. But even as a little girl, I sensed something haunted her. Whenever I'd ask about my father, her eyes would cloud over like a storm was just behind them. He was complicated, she'd say. That was her word for him. Complicated. We lived modestly in a little brick house just outside Columbia, South Carolina. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe. And safe was something she worked hard to give me. I went to a public school, wore thrift store jeans, and had birthday cakes made from scratch because store-bought was too impersonal, she claimed. But now I know she just couldn't afford them. It wasn't until I was 17 that I found out who he really was. I came home from school one day and heard raised voices, my mother and a man I'd never seen before. He was tall, clean-cut, and wore a suit that screamed money. I listened from behind the door. I didn't catch everything, but I heard enough. She has a right to know, my mom had said, her voice trembling. She doesn't need to be dragged into my world, he replied. That's not the life I wanted for her. When I pushed the door open, they both froze. My mom's face drained of color, and the man, he just looked at me like he was staring into a mirror that showed too much. That night, she told me everything. Jonathan Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Industries, billionaire, influential, untouchable, and my biological father. She said they had met in her final year of college. She was studying journalism. He was already building his company. It had been a whirlwind romance, passionate, intense, and over just as quickly. She found out she was pregnant weeks after he'd walked out of her life. When she told him, he didn't deny the child was his, but he made it clear he wasn't going to be a father, not publicly. He paid her off, generously, but she refused the money. She wanted to raise me without being someone's dirty secret, and so she did. I didn't know how to process it. Part of me was furious. How could she hide this from me? Another part of me felt shattered. All those years wondering why I wasn't enough for someone to stay, and the answer had been sitting across the dinner table all along. I wanted to confront him, to scream, to understand, but instead I buried it, just like she had, until the letter arrived. It was a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note, 2 lines in clean cursive. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I hope this helps make up for the years I couldn't be there. Attached was a copy of his last will and testament. I stared at the words for hours before they made sense. The company, the assets, the estate. He left it all to me. I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I just sat there in the kitchen where my mom had cooked every meal with love, holding a piece of paper that would change everything. Of course, nothing is ever that simple. The moment I stepped into the Whitmore estate for the reading of the will, I could feel the tension wrap around me like a vice. His legitimate family, his wife, Caroline, and their 2 sons, Henry and Davis, looked at me like I had crawled out from under the floorboards. I was the disruption, the shame, the inconvenient truth. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading. It was like watching their faces melt in slow motion. To my daughter, Evelyn Grace, I leave the entirety of my company holdings, assets, and controlling interest in Whitmore Industries. Silence. Then chaos. Caroline stood up, knocking over her chair. Henry muttered something under his breath. Davis just stared at me with an expression I couldn't name. Disgust? Confusion? Maybe both. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The will spoke louder than anything I could have said. As I walked out of that room, I realized something. They weren't just shocked. They were terrified, because I wasn't just the secret anymore. I was the heir. Taking over a company sounds dramatic in theory. In practice, it's an endless parade of confusion, tension, and people pretending to smile while secretly hoping you fail. I had no experience running a business, let alone a billion-dollar empire. I didn't go to Ivy League schools like Henry or Davis. I didn't have a polished resume or a list of corporate mentors. What I had was a degree in comparative literature, a small apartment, and a lifetime of watching my mother rebuild herself from scratch. So maybe I didn't know finance, but I did know how to survive, and I was about to learn quickly. The first few weeks were brutal. Every board member looked at me like I was a joke. Some outright refused to acknowledge me. The head of marketing, a slick guy named Marcus, cornered me after a meeting and said, "If you need help understanding how this place works, I'm sure one of us can walk you through it. Maybe start with the basics." I smiled, the way my mother used to when she was holding back tears. "Thanks, Marcus. I already understand how this place works. That's why I'm watching everything." His smirk faded. I wasn't stupid enough to think I could do this alone. So I hired someone who terrified everyone else. Victoria Ellis, a no-nonsense consultant with a reputation for restructuring toxic companies from the inside out. She wore heels like armor and carried silence like a weapon. I liked her instantly. "You're going to lose people," she told me on day 1. "Friends, fake allies, maybe even your mind. But if you want to do this for real, you need to stop thinking like a daughter and start thinking like a Whitmore." I didn't want to be like him. Not really, but I understood what she meant. If I wanted to make this mine, I had to stop apologizing for existing. Meanwhile, Caroline and her sons were doing everything in their power to sabotage me. Henry leaked rumors to the press about my inexperience. Davis tried to call an emergency board vote to reverse my inheritance, arguing emotional instability. The irony wasn't lost on me, coming from a man who once drunkenly fell asleep in a boardroom during a quarterly review. But the worst part wasn't what they did, it was what they knew. Because they had something I didn't. History. They had grown up in the halls of Whitmore Industries. Their portraits hung in conference rooms. Their names were etched into plaques and office doors. They belonged. I didn't. Or at least, that's what they wanted me to believe. Then I started digging. It started with old ledgers, nothing dramatic, just financial reports from a decade ago. But something didn't add up. There were discrepancies, tiny numbers shuffled between departments, over and over, like someone was laundering money through the company. I brought it to Victoria. "This isn't small," she said, her eyes narrowing. "And it's not random." We followed the trail for weeks. Quietly, carefully. Every lead brought us closer to something bigger. Offshore accounts, fake vendors, phantom employees on the payroll. The deeper we looked, the clearer it became. Someone inside had been bleeding the company dry for years, and all signs pointed to Caroline. She wasn't just angry about the will. She was scared, because my father's death hadn't just exposed me. It was exposing everything. I started receiving anonymous emails, threats disguised as concerns. One warned me to drop the audit or risk destroying your father's legacy. Another mentioned my mother by name. I showed them to Victoria. They're trying to rattle you, she said, which means we're getting close. I was torn between fear and fury. Fear, because these people weren't just emotionally manipulative, they were powerful. Fury, because I had spent my entire life thinking I didn't matter. And now that I had something they couldn't control, they were desperate to rip it from me. I visited my mother for the first time in weeks. She looked older than I remembered. Or maybe I just hadn't noticed the lines before, the ones that came from carrying secrets too long. I think he knew, I told her. Before he died, I think that's why he left it to me. She nodded slowly. Your father, he wasn't a good man in many ways, but in the end, I believe he wanted to do one good thing. I asked her if she thought I could do this, if I was strong enough. She didn't hesitate. You've already done more than I ever could, she said softly. That's not because you're his daughter. It's because you're mine. That night, I stopped seeing the company as a burden. It was a weapon, and I wasn't going to let them bury me with it. It happened on a Thursday, quiet, gray, and ordinary in every way. Until it wasn't. Victoria and I had spent the morning in a small office tucked away on the 20th floor, combing through more documents. We were getting closer. You could feel it in the silence between us, the kind of quiet that buzzes with electricity. Then she froze mid-page and looked up at me. This one's not just shady, it's illegal. She handed me the file, a vendor listed under media consulting, a company that didn't exist 6 months ago. But this ghost firm had billed the company over $2 million in under a year. Payments approved by none other than Davis Whitmore. But it wasn't just the fake company that stopped me cold. It was the address listed on the invoice. I recognized it immediately. It was a townhouse on the Upper East Side, Caroline's, the same address where she hosted her charity galas and exclusive garden parties. The same house that had once belonged to my father and now belonged to her. A line from the file echoed in my head, paid in full. For media silence, I leaned back in my chair, heart thudding. What do you think they're silencing? I asked. Victoria was already on her phone. We're going to find out. We had just begun to pull the thread when everything started to unravel. That afternoon, Henry barged into my office unannounced. No knock, no warning. He was shaking. You've crossed a line, he snapped. I didn't flinch. Which line exactly? The one where we stopped stealing from the company. His face went pale. You have no idea what you're messing with. Try me. He stormed out, but the message was clear. I was getting too close. That night, I received a text from an unknown number. One sentence. If you want the truth, go to storage room C. I almost deleted it, thinking it was another threat. But something about the phrasing felt different. Not a warning. A direction. The next morning, I took the service elevator down to the lower levels of the building. Floors most executives never stepped foot on. Storage room C was tucked behind rows of old supply closets and forgotten office chairs. I expected dust and cobwebs. I didn't expect locked cabinets labeled legal, 1997, and medical, confidential. One drawer was already slightly open. Inside, I found a folder with my mother's name on it. I stared at it for a long moment before pulling it out. Inside were photocopies of medical forms, insurance claims, and a series of court documents I'd never seen. Custody agreements, non-disclosure clauses, a handwritten letter. I unfolded the letter carefully. It was addressed to me, to my daughter. If you are reading this, it means you've come far, maybe farther than I ever expected you to. I wanted to tell you everything when you turned 18, but I didn't. I was a coward. I let the lawyers and the board convince me it would be cleaner if you didn't know. The truth is, I loved your mother. I should have fought for her. But I was weak, and my family, Caroline, used that weakness. She found out about you. She paid your mother to stay silent, and she threatened to destroy her if she didn't comply. I signed the agreement. I sent money every month. But I watched from afar and I saw who you became. And I knew, when the time came, I would make it right. GW. My hands trembled. He had known. He hadn't abandoned us. He had been forced into silence. And Caroline, she hadn't just lied. She had blackmailed him into erasing me from his life. I wasn't a secret because I didn't matter. I was a secret because I threatened everything they stood for. Victoria found me sitting on the floor with the folder in my lap. "You okay?" she asked quietly. "No," I whispered. "But I finally know who they are, and who I am." We scanned and locked every document in a secure file. I didn't tell anyone else. Not yet. But I kept the letter close, folded neatly in the inside pocket of my blazer. Because now it wasn't just about justice. It was personal. I walked back into that boardroom the next week with a new look in my eye. Not defiance. Not fear. Power. They had tried to erase me. But now I held the truth. And I wasn't going to whisper anymore. The letter changed everything, but not in the way I expected. I didn't cry. I didn't collapse. I didn't scream. Instead, I felt an eerie kind of stillness, as if my entire life had been floating, unmoored, and had just now found an anchor. I didn't tell anyone. Not Caroline, not Henry, not even the board. Not yet. I needed to understand the full scope of what I was holding before I used it. And more than that, I needed to be ready. I spent the next few days moving silently through the corridors of the company like a ghost with purpose. I watched people more closely. I listened to how they spoke when they thought I wasn't paying attention. Caroline avoided me. Henry stared at me like I was a ticking time bomb. They felt it. Something had shifted. But the most surprising reaction came from Victoria. She was quieter, too. One afternoon, we were in the records room, scanning the last few files we had pulled. I noticed her watching me, not with pity, but with something closer to awe. "You haven't fallen apart," she said softly. I gave her a tired smile. "Not yet." I would have, if I found out my entire life was buried in a storage room. I leaned against the cold filing cabinet. Maybe I did fall apart, just a long time ago. Now I'm just rearranged. She nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. That night, I drove to the old neighborhood where I'd grown up. The streets were darker than I remembered, the sidewalks cracked. My mother's house had long since been sold. But I sat across from it anyway in the car and remembered the way she used to hum while cooking, the way she kissed my forehead with trembling hands every time she thought about bills she couldn't pay. She'd sacrificed everything to keep me safe, and they had erased her like she never existed. I stared at that house and made myself a promise. I would make sure her name was never forgotten again. The next morning, I began the quiet work of assembling a plan. I didn't confront them, not immediately. Instead, I started asking questions in places they didn't expect. I called the family's old lawyer under the guise of reassessing our compliance policy. I met with old board members my father had worked with, ones who had stepped down quietly over the years, and asked about his health, about his decisions. One of them, a man named Ray Templeton, looked at me over his coffee and said something I'll never forget. "He always regretted what happened with your mother," he said. "He talked about you more than anyone else. Said you were the only thing in his life that didn't feel like a performance." My throat tightened. Why didn't he say anything? Ray sighed. "Because men like your father, they don't always get to choose how their stories are told." The board wrote the script. Caroline held the pen. Back at the office, Caroline was getting nervous. She summoned me to her private suite, the kind of lush, marble-covered space that screamed privilege and legacy. She poured tea like we were at a garden party, not circling each other in a psychological chess match. "I've noticed you've been busy," she said with a sharp smile. "Curiosity tends to follow unanswered questions," I replied. Her smile faltered for just a second. "I hope you're not digging into old things that were resolved long ago," she said. "Oh, I'm just making sure we're all aligned on the company's legacy," I said sweetly. She paused, then leaned forward. "You've always been emotional. That's your nature. Passionate. But in business, that kind of thing, it gets messy. Don't let your feelings cloud your judgment." There it was. The same dismissiveness I'd been fed my entire life, just dressed in designer silk and cold civility. But this time, I didn't shrink under it. This time I smiled. "Don't worry, Caroline," I said calmly. "I've never been clearer." That night, I received another message, this one from an anonymous email address. It contained one attachment, an audio recording. I hesitated, then pressed play. It was my father's voice, raw, shaky. I wanted to change the will before it was too late. I told them, Caroline, Henry, the board, but they threatened to leak everything if I did. Said they'd bury the company in lawsuits and scandal. Said she, my daughter, would suffer for it. I'm ashamed. I let them silence me, but I'm trying to set it right now. If she's hearing this, then I did it. I changed the will. The company is hers. I froze. He had known. He had tried. He had risked everything to put it in writing, to give me what was rightfully mine. This wasn't just a whisper of legacy anymore. It was proof. I looked at Victoria across the table and whispered, "We have everything we need now." The recording changed the entire rhythm of my days. Suddenly, every breath I took felt charged with clarity. The truth was no longer a fragile secret hidden in a filing cabinet or buried in whispers. It was now something solid, something I could wield. But clarity doesn't come without consequence. That week, I noticed changes, subtle at first. A few investors pulled out of routine meetings with vague excuses. The head of PR, a woman who had always been cold but polite, began avoiding eye contact. Even the baristas downstairs seemed to lower their voices when I walked by. It didn't take long to figure out why. Caroline and Henry had found out I was digging deeper. I wasn't just a quiet analyst anymore. I was a threat, but they didn't confront me directly. No, they were far too elegant for that. Instead, they began weaving a narrative. Whispers started circulating that I was erratic, overly emotional, not fit for a leadership role. They resurrected the same weapon they'd always used against me. Doubt. She's unstable. She's too reactive. She's not like her father. They wanted me to spiral, to prove their point for them. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into something I hadn't relied on before, allies. Victoria had been by my side, loyal and quiet. But now, I needed more than quiet loyalty. I needed someone who could navigate the company's internal web. Someone who could see things I couldn't. So I turned to Thomas. He was the director of operations, older, with the kind of resume that carried weight, but more importantly, with a reputation for integrity. He'd been close to my father once. I approached him one evening in the parking garage, where shadows made conversations safer. "I know who I am now," I said quietly, "and I know what they've done, but I can't take them down alone." Thomas didn't flinch. He looked at me like he had been waiting for this moment. Then he handed me a USB drive. "Your father gave this to me," he said. "Told me to wait. Said I'd know when to pass it on." I stared at the drive in my palm like it was a piece of fate itself. When I opened it later that night, I found a digital archive of documents, board meeting transcripts, emails between Henry and Caroline, signed non-disclosures, threats made to employees who had dared question their authority. But one file stood out, a scanned letter, dated only 3 weeks before my father's stroke. "To whom it may concern. It has come to my attention that several senior board members, including Caroline Wren and Henry Black, have knowingly obstructed the process of legally updating my estate. Their actions are in direct violation of corporate policy and may include fraud, coercion, and intentional suppression of documentation. I have made arrangements for my daughter to receive all that is rightfully hers. He had tried again, even at the end, even when it was dangerous. It was more than a legacy now, it was a war. And just as I was preparing to confront them with this truth, another complication appeared. Victoria rushed into my office one morning, breathless and pale. "You need to see this." She handed me a printed document, an emergency motion filed with the board, requesting a vote to remove me from the company on the grounds of unethical behavior and emotional instability. Caroline had moved faster than I expected. They were going to try and exile me before I could speak. I stared at the document. My hands didn't shake. My stomach didn't twist. Instead, I felt something I hadn't expected, gratitude. Because now they had shown their hand. They were scared. That same afternoon, I held a private meeting with Thomas and 3 other department heads who had long suspected something was off. We sat around a table in the old strategy room, the one with the etched glass windows and heavy oak chairs. I showed them the documents, the audio, the letters, the proof. No one spoke for a full minute. Then Thomas said, "If we stand with you, it won't be easy." "I'm not asking for easy," I replied. "I'm asking for justice." They nodded, one by one. The room, once heavy with doubt, began to shift. We weren't just employees anymore. We were architects of a reckoning. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked through the city, letting the cold wind keep me alert. I passed buildings my father had designed, parks my mother used to take me to, the diner where I had studied late into the night for exams I had to pass just to prove I deserved to be there. And I realized something. I wasn't doing this just to claim an inheritance. I was doing this for every version of me they had tried to silence. For every girl who had been told she was too emotional to lead. For every daughter erased from the narrative because she didn't fit their image of control. The days that followed were filled with a strange kind of stillness, like the deep inhale before a scream. Every conversation I had, every glance exchanged in the hallways felt like it carried the weight of something unsaid. I wasn't hiding anymore, but neither were they. The vote to remove me was scheduled for Friday. And in the lead up to that day, the company transformed into a battlefield in disguise. I started to see faces more clearly. Some people I thought were loyal avoided me entirely. Others, who had once stayed silent in meetings, suddenly smiled and asked if I needed help. There was a quiet shift in power, the kind you don't see in headlines, but you feel it in elevator silences, in boardroom pauses, in the way even coffee tasted different. But the emotional weight came not from strangers. It came from family. Caroline called me late one night. No warning, no greeting, just her voice, cold and sharp. "You think you're making things right," she said, "but all you're doing is tearing down what your father built." I didn't answer at first. I wanted to, but there was something deeper in her tone, something I hadn't expected. Fear, yes, but also its grief. "You were never supposed to be part of this," she continued. "He didn't want this life for you. He wanted to protect you. Is that why you erased me?" I asked softly, because it was easier than sharing. Silence, and then she whispered, "Because we loved him too." For a moment, the war disappeared. I wasn't talking to a villain. I was talking to a woman who had been part of my father's life for longer than I'd been alive, who had seen him rise, fail, and rise again, who had stayed, even when he kept me hidden. And suddenly, I didn't know who I hated anymore. The next day, I went to my father's study, the one Caroline had locked after the funeral. I still had the spare key. The room hadn't changed. His scent was faint, but there, cologne and leather and ink. His desk was untouched, a notebook open to the last page he'd ever written in. I sat in his chair, and for the first time, I allowed myself to feel everything. The betrayal, the confusion, the sorrow of a daughter who had grown up knowing she was someone's secret. It wasn't just a company at stake. It was identity. Who was I really? The abandoned daughter? The chosen heir? A revenge seeker? A leader? I didn't have the answers, but I did have purpose. Later that week, I met with the company's legal counsel, a young woman named Nadine, brilliant and refreshingly honest. I showed her everything: the files, the voice recordings, the letters, the will my father had tried to update twice. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned forward. "There's enough here to challenge their authority," she said. "But more than that, there's enough to make this public." The word echoed in my mind, public. To bring everything out into the open meant exposing not just them, but myself. The world would know I was hidden, that I was a secret born from something complicated. I would no longer be just an executive. I'd be a headline, a symbol, a story people passed around at dinner tables. Was I ready for that? I went home and sat in front of the mirror. No makeup, no mask, just me. I looked older than I remembered, stronger, but tired. I thought about the little girl I used to be, the one who waited at the window for a man who never came, the one who built entire worlds out of silence and made peace with being forgotten. I whispered to her, "He did love you," in his own broken way. And she didn't cry. She just nodded, because now she wasn't alone. The final days before the vote were strategic. My team gathered the department heads who supported me, forming a silent coalition. We prepared legal statements, reviewed emergency protections in the corporate charter, and made sure the press wouldn't get the story from anyone but us, if it came to that. But I also reached out to someone I never thought I would. My mother. She had stayed far away from all of it, as if pretending none of it mattered. But I needed to see her. When she opened the door, she didn't ask why I was there. She just said, "You look like him." We sat at the kitchen table, the one she'd cried on when I was 6, the one where she told me, "He's busy, baby. He can't come today." I asked her why she never fought for me to be part of his life. She sighed, "Because I didn't want you to grow up thinking love had to be earned." And just like that, a truth I didn't even know I was waiting for hit me. He had hidden me, yes, but she had protected me. 2 broken parents, 2 half-truths, and somewhere in between, a daughter trying to find her place. By the time I left her house, the emotional storm inside me had settled into something new. Resolve. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about healing, and I would no longer let anyone define that path for me. Friday arrived with the weight of finality. The boardroom smelled of fresh coffee and tension. Every chair was occupied. Every breath felt measured. This was it, the vote. Caroline sat across from me, her expression calm but unreadable. Her husband, Richard, wore a navy suit and a smugness he didn't bother to hide. Others glanced between us like spectators before a fight, but I had something none of them expected: leverage. I stood and spoke first. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't plead. I told them who I was. I reminded them who my father was. And then I showed them proof, documents signed by my father before his death. Emails he wrote to his attorney. His voice, preserved in a message he'd left me just 2 months before the stroke. "I want the company to go to her," his voice echoed through the room. "She's ready. She's always been ready." Silence followed, until Caroline stood. Her voice was ice. That message could be fake. I expected her to deny it, but instead she walked to the window, staring out over the skyline. "What if he did want to give it to her?" she said slowly. He was slipping. Everyone knew it. He wasn't himself anymore. Paranoid. Confused. She turned toward the board. "Is this who you want making your decisions? A girl raised outside of this world, with no legacy but a voice message and a handful of letters." She paused. Let it sink in. She's not ready. That was her strategy. Undermine my stability. Cast doubt not on the facts, but on me. And I could see it working. Eyes darting around, uncertainty rising like smoke. Until Nadine, my legal counsel, spoke. "She's more ready than you realize," Nadine said, stepping forward. "In the last 3 weeks, she's stabilized the Chicago project, restructured 2 major partnerships, and uncovered financial inconsistencies in this board's travel expenditures. Gasps. Shifting chairs. Richard coughed. Oh yes, that part. I turned to him, calm. We found the invoices, the offshore accounts, the false travel logs. He opened his mouth, closed it. I took a step forward. You tried to discredit me, but in doing so, you left your own trail exposed. And just like that, the air shifted again. They weren't just questioning me anymore. They were questioning them. Caroline didn't flinch, but her knuckles tightened around the chair. The vote was postponed. Indefinitely. They needed time to reassess, which of course meant one thing, damage control. But something else happened after the meeting. An older board member, Walter, one of the founding partners, approached me. He walked slowly, but his eyes were sharp. I knew your father before he had anything, he said. And I remember the day he told me about you. He was terrified. Of what? I asked. Of loving you too much. That stayed with me for days. And then came the next shock. In the process of auditing the company's records with Nadine's help, we stumbled on a strange detail, an old investment fund my father had set up decades ago. It had one beneficiary, me, but it wasn't just an account. It was tied to a property he had purchased in my name when I was still a child. I flew to Boston the next day. The address led me to an old townhouse, unassuming on the outside but clearly maintained. The caretaker, an elderly woman named Joan, greeted me with watery eyes the moment I introduced myself. You're her, she whispered. She showed me inside. The walls were lined with books, toys, photos, snapshots of a life never lived. My photos, my school drawings, letters my father had written to me but never sent. He had built a home for me here, a secret home, one he'd filled with love and absence. He hadn't ignored me. He had tried to give me everything from a distance. And in that moment, the rage I had carried for years crumbled. It didn't vanish, but it shifted. He had failed me in ways I would never fully understand, but he had also loved me in ways I hadn't seen. I sat in the living room, staring at a framed picture of me as a toddler. He was holding me, smiling. I hadn't even known that photo existed. And then I knew what I had to do. This wasn't just about inheritance. This was about legacy. Not his, mine. If I was going to lead this company, it would be on my terms. Transparent, ethical, real. I returned to New York with a new plan, one that would change everything. After returning from Boston, something inside me had shifted. An anchor dropped deep into my chest, no longer dragging me down but grounding me. The townhouse had opened a door inside me I didn't know existed, one that showed me the fragments of a man who had lived 2 lives. Now I was ready to live mine fully, without secrecy, without shame. But just as I started reclaiming my place, Caroline made her next move. She launched a media campaign. One morning, I woke up to headlines questioning my legitimacy, the stability of the company under my inexperienced leadership, and even my mental health. There were whispers of fabricated degrees, claims that I was manipulating the board emotionally with tales of a hidden childhood. I knew where it was coming from. The words were carefully planted, designed to sting but not be traceable. But she'd made a mistake. She underestimated who I had become. Instead of fighting fire with fire, I went quiet, strategic. I met with each board member privately over the course of 2 weeks. No assistants, no attorneys, just face-to-face conversations. I told them the truth, not just the emotional story, but the facts, the numbers, the performance stats since I'd stepped in, the recoveries from past mismanagement. I didn't beg for trust. I showed them why I had earned it. Meanwhile, Nadine quietly opened an internal investigation. We discovered that Caroline had been leaking confidential company documents to the press through a third party, Richard's cousin, who ran a gossip blog disguised as business commentary. We were building a case. But while that storm brewed, I also began to connect the dots of my father's emotional legacy, the one outside the boardroom. I found out he had been supporting my mother anonymously through a trust fund all these years, sending her money every month, covering her health insurance, and paying off her mortgage when she was sick. He hadn't dared reconnect directly, likely out of guilt or fear, but he had never abandoned her entirely. That discovery softened something between my mother and me. We had always carried wounds, silent, sharp, but now we began talking more honestly. She admitted things I never expected, that she had loved him until the end, even if their story had been painful, that she had kept my last name hers on purpose, waiting for the day when I'd find my way back to that truth. It was strange how much clarity came from simply talking. Meanwhile, the board began to shift. Walter, the elder partner, rallied support quietly. A few of the newer members, people I had once seen as cold or dismissive, began backing my ideas in meetings. I could feel the tide turning, not by force, but by gravity. But Richard, he wasn't done yet. One evening, after a long strategy session, I found him waiting near the company garage. He lit a cigarette like it was a casual Tuesday night and offered me one. I declined. He smiled, bitter. "You know, you weren't supposed to matter," he said. "You were a rumor, a distraction." I didn't answer. He kept talking. We spent years planning. Caroline did everything. Managed the press, softened the board, built alliances. We made your father think it was his idea to let her run things. He paused, staring at the smoke curling in the cold air. But then he left everything to you. There was pain in his voice, but not just anger. Wounded pride. A man who had played the long game and lost to a wild card. "I don't want the company," he said finally. "I just want her to win." I nodded. "I understand that, but she won't." He laughed softly. "You don't have it in you." But that was where he was wrong. Because I did. I had strength built from abandonment, clarity forged through grief, and a stubborn belief in doing things the right way. When I walked away from him that night, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt ready. The next day, Nadine filed a formal complaint against Caroline and Richard for breaches of board ethics. Evidence was included. An emergency board session was called. The walls were closing in, and in the middle of all this chaos, I received an envelope. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, my father's handwriting. A letter, dated 2 weeks before his stroke. "If you're reading this, I didn't make it. I'm sorry. I wanted to tell you in person, but I ran out of courage. You were always more than I could ever give you credit for. This company, it's yours now. Not because you're my daughter, but because you're the only one who still believes it can be more than power. Make it that. Make it human. That's all I ask." I sat with that letter for a long time, and then I knew this wasn't just about winning the company back. It was about rebuilding something he had lost sight of long ago, something I now carried: hope. The emergency board meeting was set for Monday morning at 9 a.m. sharp. The conference room on the 33rd floor, the same one where I had once stood invisible at the back of the room, was now the place where everything would shift. The skyline behind me was painted in soft grays and hints of gold, the morning fog just beginning to lift over San Francisco. I wore black, not out of mourning, but as armor. Simple, sharp lines. No emotion on my sleeves. Caroline arrived 10 minutes late. She was wearing a bright red blazer, her lips painted to match. A statement. She smiled at the room as if walking onto a stage. Richard was already seated, jaw clenched, not making eye contact with anyone. Walter called the meeting to order. The room fell silent, and then, with steady hands and a clear voice, Nadine began the presentation. Documented leaks, email chains, metadata proving connections between Caroline's personal assistant and the media outlets that had mysteriously obtained internal reports. Payments made to Richard's cousin. Dates, times, names. Each revelation landed like a thunderclap. Caroline tried to interject. "This is absurd. Fabricated." But no one looked at her. They looked at the screen, at the evidence, at the truth. It was undeniable. Richard stood abruptly. "You people are hypocrites. You didn't care when I worked 16-hour days rebuilding this company. You didn't care when I covered Caroline's mistakes. But now, you're ready to burn it all down for her." His voice cracked on that last word, her, as if it tasted bitter on his tongue. He left before the vote. Caroline stayed, eyes burning, her expression unreadable. But her silence spoke louder than any of her headlines ever had. When the board voted to suspend her pending further investigation, she didn't argue. She stood, adjusted her blazer, and walked out like a queen accepting exile. And then silence. I sat there for a moment, staring at the empty chairs they'd left behind. The war they had waged, quietly, strategically, without a single blade drawn, was over. But that wasn't the climax. The real breaking point came that evening. After the meeting, I visited my father's old office, the one that had been locked since the day after his funeral. I had avoided it, maybe out of respect, maybe out of fear. But now, it felt like the final thread I needed to untangle. Inside, the room smelled of aged wood and forgotten time. His chair was still tucked in, his pen still resting in the leather tray. I sat at his desk, my hand brushing over the notepad, the picture of me as a toddler tucked into the corner of the frame. There was a small locked drawer on the right. I didn't expect it to be open, but it was. Inside, I found 3 items: a faded photograph of my mother holding me as a baby, a cassette tape labeled simply for her, and a small cloth-bound book. I brought them home. That night, in the quiet of my apartment, I played the tape. It was his voice, tired, raspy, recorded not long before the stroke, I guessed. I've lived 2 lives, one with the company and one with the shadow of a daughter I never got to know the way I should have. If you're hearing this, it means I finally got it right. I hope you're not just running the company. I hope you're happy, really happy. I'm proud of you, even if I never said it the way you deserved. I cried, not the delicate, silent tears I'd grown used to holding in over the years, but the full-body kind, the kind that doesn't just come from grief, but from release, from hearing the words you needed your whole life, finally spoken. When I opened the cloth-bound book, I realized it was a journal. My father's. The entries started decades ago. Notes about mergers and meetings, sure, but also about dreams, fears, regrets. One entry, written years before I ever came back into his life, read, "I wonder if she'll hate me. If I've become the kind of man she'll have to tear down just to rebuild herself. I hope I haven't ruined her strength." Reading those pages didn't feel like discovering a stranger. It felt like finally meeting the man behind the myth. The next morning, I walked into the office with new eyes, not as the secret daughter, not as the girl left behind, but as the woman who had lived through the storm and stood upright, still. It was time to rebuild, to clean house, to reimagine what our legacy could be, not in Caroline's image, not in my father's old ways, but in something new, human, honest, mine. The next few days passed in a quiet storm of headlines, legal notices, and silence from Caroline and Richard. Neither returned to the office. Neither tried to reach out to me. Their absence spoke volumes, and yet it didn't bring me peace. Not entirely. There were still too many ghosts in the hallways. Too many unfinished sentences in my heart. On the 5th morning, I asked Nadine to cancel all my meetings and hold my calls. I needed one thing: closure. I found Caroline at her townhouse in Pacific Heights. The building stood like a monument to old money, gated, angular, sterile. She opened the door herself, looking almost surprised, but only almost. She was too calculated for true surprise. We didn't speak in pleasantries. There was no point. She stepped aside. I walked in. The living room was immaculately styled, not a book out of place. But beneath the surface, I could feel the tremor, the quiet unraveling. She sat down on a cream-colored chair, her posture as perfect as ever. "I suppose you're here to watch me fall," she said, folding her hands. No, I replied. You already fell. I'm just here to understand why. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Her eyes stayed fixed on the marble coffee table between us. And then, quietly, bitterly, she answered, because I was supposed to be the heir. I was there every day, every meeting, every decision. I gave up my marriage, my child, my soul, and he gave it all to you. To a daughter he barely knew. I swallowed hard. I never asked him to do that, I said. She finally looked at me, then, really looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something beneath the frost. Exhaustion, defeat, and maybe even a trace of regret. You didn't have to, she whispered. You existed. That was enough. I could have left then, taken her words like a knife, walked away bleeding and righteous. But I didn't. Instead, I sat down across from her. You know what the worst part is, I said, my voice steady. He didn't leave it to me because he loved me more. He left it to me because he thought I could fix it. The mess, the legacy, all of it. She laughed bitterly. So now you get to be the savior. How convenient. No, I said, standing. Now I get to be the one who chooses what this company becomes. And whether you like it or not, I plan to rebuild it. Without cruelty, without secrets. She said nothing, and I left her there, in her fortress of marble and resentment, a prisoner of her own undoing. One confrontation down. The next one was harder. Richard had retreated to our father's estate in Napa, a place I had only seen in photographs, usually in magazines attached to headlines about mergers, benefits, or interviews with the visionary Richard Abernethy. I drove up alone, the winding road cutting through vineyards and ancient oaks. The sun was setting as I arrived, casting long shadows across the gravel path. He met me on the porch, drink in hand. His eyes were red, maybe from the whiskey, maybe not. Took you long enough, he muttered. I wasn't sure you'd want to see me, I replied. I don't, he said, but you came anyway. We stood in silence, and then I said it. I'm not here to gloat. I'm not here for revenge. I just want to know, when did it stop being about the company for you? He looked down at his glass. When he brought you back, he said softly. That's when everything shifted. I spent years proving myself to him. Years doing everything right. And he still gave it all to you. That broke something in me. I stopped believing it mattered. So I started taking. I nodded, more hurt than angry. I didn't ask to be his daughter, I said. I just was. He looked up at me, and in his eyes, for the first time, I saw my brother, not the polished executive, not the public face, but the lost boy underneath. I know, he said, and I think maybe that's what made it worse. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. We didn't make promises we couldn't keep. But we sat together for a while on that porch, two orphans of ambition, watching the last light slip over the hills. The next day, I returned to the office. I called a full company-wide meeting. Employees, departments, janitorial staff, interns. Everyone. I stood on the stage in the atrium, where my father had once given speeches about vision and growth. But I spoke about something else. I talked about mistakes, about humility, about the power of starting over. And then I did something none of them expected. I announced a complete restructuring of our leadership hierarchy. New voices, new departments, a cultural audit, a wellness initiative, transparent ethics reviews. We weren't going to be the biggest anymore, or the richest, but we were going to be better, because legacy wasn't about control. It was about courage. The dust hadn't settled, not really. Public perception was a storm of curiosity, skepticism, and grudging admiration. Some media outlets called it a hostile takeover masked in sentiment. Others praised the moral shakeup of a legacy empire. But I wasn't thinking about headlines anymore. I was thinking about what it meant to carry something that was never meant to be mine, and make it my own anyway. Every morning, I still walked past portraits of a man whose approval I never had the chance to seek. My father's eyes stared out from the lobby wall, immortalized in oil paint, frozen in the posture of a man who thought he would live forever. I didn't speak to it, but sometimes I paused, and I wondered if he ever imagined the cost of silence. The board was restless, not outwardly, not with words, but in the little ways. The way they watched me now, the way their questions held double meanings. Their loyalty had always been to my father's image. Now, with him gone, I had to prove that the name was more than a ghost. It came to a head in a meeting late on a Thursday afternoon. The room was full, executives, legal advisors, 3 board members dialing in from Tokyo. I had just finished presenting the roadmap for our shift towards socially responsible investments. It was bold. Some said reckless. I could feel the hesitation hanging like static in the air. That's when Mr. Bennett, one of the oldest board members and my father's longest-serving confidant, leaned forward and said, "You're gambling with a legacy that took decades to build. Do you even understand what you're doing?" I met his gaze. Calm. Clear. "I do," I said. "For the first time, I really do." He raised an eyebrow. "And what if it fails?" I took a breath and let the silence stretch before answering. "Then we fail with integrity, and we rebuild with purpose. I'm not here to wear my father's crown. I'm here to unlearn the kingdom." That room, so polished, so cold, went utterly still. Not everyone agreed, but they heard me, and that was the shift I'd been waiting for. Still, not everyone was ready to let go. That night, I received an envelope delivered by hand. No return address, no signature. Inside, a simple photograph, my mother and my father together, smiling. Somewhere I'd never been. On the back, in my father's handwriting, "I should have tried harder. I thought silence would protect you." It undid me. I sat on the edge of my bed for what felt like hours, staring at that single sentence. His admission, so small, so late, and yet it meant everything. I would never get the full story, never hear his voice saying those words. But I had them now, and maybe that was enough. The next morning, I went to see my mother. She was living in a modest home in Santa Rosa, a far cry from the sprawling estate where her story began. She opened the door with hesitant eyes, but there was no anger there anymore, just the weight of time. "I got your message," she said softly. "And the photo." I stepped inside, not sure what I wanted to say, only that I had to say something. "I think I hated you for a while," I admitted. "Not for leaving, but for not fighting harder." She nodded slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she poured us both tea. "I hated myself too," she said, "but I was trying to protect you in my own way. I didn't want you to grow up surrounded by half-truths and cold expectations." I looked around the quiet living room, the knitted blankets, the faded curtains, the framed photo of a child I barely remembered being. "I grew up without knowing who I was," I said. "But maybe I needed to lose everything to finally find it." My mother reached across the table and took my hand. No grand apology, no dramatic monologue, just presence, just peace. Back at the company, the changes I implemented started taking root. Slowly but surely, new hires, younger voices, diversity initiatives. We partnered with community programs, funded mentorships, made transparency a pillar rather than a buzzword. Not everyone stayed. Some resigned quietly, unable to adapt to a culture where power no longer shielded abuse. But those who remained, the ones who believed in the vision, they became the foundation of something real, something human. I found myself working late nights, but for once, not because I was trying to prove myself. I stayed because I cared, because I finally understood what it meant to build, not for approval, but for purpose. And somewhere in that process, the grief started to fade, not disappear, but soften around the edges. My father's portrait still hung in the lobby, but now beside it there was another, a small plaque with my mother's name, founder of the community initiative that helped women re-enter the workforce, a legacy of a different kind. And my own? I wasn't sure yet, but I knew one thing. I would carry it forward with open eyes and an open heart, because being the secret daughter of a CEO didn't define me. choosing what kind of leader I became. That was my story now. The company's annual summit was something of a ritual, one my father had crafted with meticulous care over decades. It was where deals were made behind closed doors, where reputations were cemented or shattered. And now it was mine to open. To stand on that stage, in front of hundreds of shareholders, employees, and press, it felt like walking into the very heart of his legacy. I wasn't nervous. I was resolved. I wore a black suit, not for mourning, but for clarity, for command, for remembrance. The auditorium lights were hot, and the air held that tension of expectation, thick with curiosity and doubt. Cameras flashed. Whispers passed between rows. But when I stepped up to the podium, I didn't speak right away. I looked out at all of them. So many faces who once saw me as a nobody, a ghost, an inconvenience, and some who had grown to believe in me, despite everything. And then I spoke, not as a CEO trying to uphold a dynasty, but as a woman who had clawed her way through silence to reclaim her name. I wasn't raised in this world. I began voice even. I wasn't groomed to lead a corporation. I didn't sit at boardroom tables as a child or learn about market shares over dinner. I grew up in the shadows of a story that was never told. A story about a man, a secret, and a daughter. There was a shift in the room, small but noticeable. The kind that comes when people realize this won't be business as usual. My father hid me. Out of shame? Fear? Maybe love, twisted by ambition. I may never know. But when he died, he didn't just leave me his company. He left me a question. What kind of legacy will you choose to build when no one expects you to? I pause, letting the silence speak. I've asked myself that question every single day since. And this company, this moment, is my answer. I walked away from the podium, letting my voice carry through the hall without the barrier between us. We are not here to preserve a frozen idea of greatness. We are here to transform, to evolve. My father built an empire with stone walls and iron doors. I intend to build something else, something with windows, with bridges, with mirrors. The applause was hesitant at first, polite, then stronger, and finally something real. I saw people standing, not all of them, but enough. That night, after the summit, I stood alone in my father's old office for the first time since the keys had been turned over to me. The room was untouched, his fountain pen still resting beside an unopened letter, the one he'd meant to send me. I opened it with shaking hands. I was wrong. I thought protecting my image meant protecting you. I see now that it was you who could have saved me, if only I'd let you in. There it was, the last of him. Not a grand apology, not absolution, just truth delivered too late, but still received. I sat at his desk and wept, not because I needed his forgiveness anymore, but because I had finally forgiven myself for wanting it. And in that moment, I knew this was the end of his story and the beginning of mine. The next week, I initiated a complete restructuring of the company's outreach programs. We invested in small businesses led by women and people of color. We created scholarships for children from backgrounds like mine, those born invisible, whose stories deserved to be written in bold. And as the first quarter reports rolled in, there was something even better than profits. Proof. Proof that empathy didn't weaken a business, it humanized it. And that people, when trusted, when seen, rose higher than any bottom line ever could. I didn't need my father's name to shine anymore. Mine was enough. And the legacy I chose wasn't carved in marble. It was planted like a tree, rooted in pain, watered with purpose, and growing towards something bigger than either of us ever imagined. The first time I ever stepped foot in the corporate building that now bore my family name, I remember feeling like an imposter in my own skin. A part of me believed I didn't belong, not because of what I lacked, but because of how long I'd been denied. The secret child, the ghost in the records, the girl who lived her entire life without knowing she was someone's legacy. But now, walking through those halls months later, everything felt different. People looked me in the eye. Not with fear, not with doubt, with recognition, respect. The company had changed, yes, but I had changed even more. The woman I became wasn't born from inheritance. She was born from questions. Every why wasn't I enough? Every how could they forget me? Every moment I thought being emotional was a flaw instead of a strength. My heart had always been my compass, and maybe for a long time it led me in circles, but eventually it led me home. Not to a building, not to a name, but to myself. I took one last look at the old family photograph that hung behind the executive desk. The polished frame held an image of my father, his wife, and their 2 sons. The perfect family he'd presented to the world. I used to feel like a ghost every time I saw that photo, a haunting reminder of where I never fit. But I didn't feel like a ghost anymore. So I replaced the photo, not with my own face, but with a collage. Pictures of our team, community initiatives, the women we'd sponsored through business grants, the students who had sent handwritten letters after receiving scholarships. The real legacy, because that's what matters. Not the empire we inherit, but what we do with it when no one's watching. In the months that followed, I took a step back from the spotlight. Not to disappear, but to empower others. I didn't need to be at the center of every decision to know my impact would last. I had already planted the roots. One day, during a quiet walk through the neighborhood where I grew up, the one where I spent years wondering who I was and why I was different, I passed by the local bookstore. Inside, a young girl sat by the window reading a business magazine. She was no older than 10, her shoes scuffed and her backpack frayed. But the way she looked at the page, like she could see herself in that world, that's when I knew. She didn't need a fairy tale. She needed a blueprint. And maybe, just maybe, I'd given her one. We never really know the weight of our stories until we stop carrying them like burdens and start sharing them like bridges. Mine was never about revenge. It wasn't about proving my worth to a man who could no longer hear me. It was about reclaiming the parts of me that were stolen by silence. About standing in the middle of a world that tried to erase me and choosing to be undeniable. To anyone out there who's ever been called too emotional, let them call you that. Because emotion isn't weakness. It's where truth lives. It's where fire starts. It's where healing begins. And if my story taught me anything, it's this. You don't have to be written into someone else's will to build your own destiny. You just have to believe that your voice deserves to be heard, even if it shakes. Especially if it shakes. Because sometimes the people who feel the most lead the best. And sometimes the ones the world forgets change it. One decision, one step, one story at a time. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe they're still searching for their place, their power, their peace. Maybe they've been told their emotions are too much, when in fact, they're just the beginning. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel because there are so many more stories waiting to be told. Stories that remind us we're never truly alone in what we feel, in what we survive, and in what we choose to become. This was Fragments of Us Stories. Until next time.